Good evening, everyone. When you thought you had enough of me this morning, here I am again. Welcome to a very special evening at John Jay College. Some of you who were there this morning have heard me describe the event as one of our most important of the year. It's an occasion when we are proud to play host to journalists, criminal justice thought leaders from across the country for candid discussions about emerging topics in justice. Our annual dinner is one of the special highlights. It is a moment when we honor the journalists who have done exciting and important work over the past year to advance public knowledge and awareness about the many challenges of our justice system. And also when we single out extraordinary people in the media or media-related fields who have made noteworthy contribution in their career to the public debate. Our justice media trailblazers. We are proud to be the host. Expanding public debate and knowledge is part of our core mission as a nation's preeminent education institution for criminal justice. And our audience this morning, all of you reflects the many constituents who are our partners, leaders of the justice community, researchers and academics from across the country, advocates for justice, reform, major foundations, journalists, and of course, our own faculty and the students. I'm looking forward to an exciting evening, but I first want to take a moment to single out some of those who have made this evening possible and ask them to stand up to be recognized. The Henry Frank Guggenheim Foundation, Dan, William, and Jill Wallman. The Charles Koch Foundation, Arnold Ventures, the team from Serial and This American Life. I would also like to recognize our former president, Jeremy Travis, and whose leadership the Center for Media Crime and Justice, the organizer, one of the organizers of tonight's event was founded. Jeremy. And of course, if I don't do that, I will leave without a job. Our president, President Carol Mason, who just came back from out-of-town trip and tried her hardest to make this happen. Thank you. Not all of you, our supporters, are here tonight, but we'd also like to extend our thanks to Eugene M. Land Foundation, Grace Farmers, and one donor who asked to remain anonymous. Now it is my special privilege to introduce our MC for the evening. Any of you who have attended previous dinners, and in fact, anyone who lives in New York City, probably needs no introduction to Errol Louis. As the host of Inside City Hall for New York One, Errol has become being one of our city's most important commentators on public affairs. His full biography is in your programs tonight, but I only need to add that Errol is back with us by popular demand. So he has emceed our Trailblazer dinners for the past several years, and you will soon find out why. So Errol, welcome to the podium.
Thank you, Provost Lee, and good evening. I'm glad everybody's here. You're in for a real treat if you haven't been to these dinners before. My name is Errol Louis. I am the political anchor at Spectrum News New York 1, and I thank all of you who watch Spectrum News New York 1. I'm also the host of a new podcast, and we're in, I think, week 4 now. So I'm a little intimidated by all these great podcasters here. It's called You Decide with Errol Louis. And the current edition, which actually went up yesterday, is a long interview with former NYPD Commissioner Bill Bratton, which I think you'll find interesting. We got to talk about a lot of different things that he did in Los Angeles and in Boston and in New York. And part of the theme that I think makes tonight so exciting is we're at a time of great promise and great ferment when it comes to criminal justice reform. As Jeremy Travis knows, there was a time not so long ago, actually about a decade ago, when a lot of us, actually it's 2 decades now, we're going to one panel after another, going from one meeting to another, talking about things like reentry, talking about things like parole reform, talking about the problems of bail and so forth. And it's really gratifying and fascinating to see a couple of decades later on the agenda in Albany and at City Hall here in New York, they are talking about closing Rikers Island, talking about abolishing cash bail, talking about reducing fees and fines, a national problem that was really spotlighted by this week's Supreme Court opinion, a unanimous opinion, that suggests that the country is ready to dial back some of the madness that was, I think, brought to national attention by the events in Ferguson. Updated discovery rules, which is another way of saying dealing with the constitutional right to a speedy trial. Parole reform, the use of cameras by law enforcement, the movements that have supported this, the movement for Black Lives, preeminently. There's so much that has been going on, and it is great to recognize tonight some of the journalists who both kept up with it and reported it and spotted it and perceived it, but also helped drive it, helped make it possible, helped explain some of the deep flaws in the criminal justice system that were crying out for reform, helped spotlight some of the opportunities for change and for reform, help bring attention to something as simple as the fact that police killings of unarmed civilians is not kept in any central registry, although it was required as part of the 1994 Crime Act. The fact that journalists here and there, you'd see a newspaper in Nevada, you'd see a newspaper in Boston, they'd come out with a big series and they try and sort of capture what was going on in their own particular area, their own particular market. But it was activists who went and started to sort of make their own databases, as well as news organizations, the Washington Post and the Guardian and a number of others. So this is a time where we're going to sort of bring all of this together. And tonight in particular, we're going to especially highlight some of, when I've come here for past awards, they conceive of media broadly here, which is really a great thing. It's not just the dead tree newspaper reporting that I grew up with. I think the first one that I came to, Piper Kerman from Orange is the New Black was one of the awardees. Last year we had Van Jones here, who's a national commentator, although he did end up in the White House, having played an important role. It really underscores the fact that some of the biggest and the best and most creative voices are moving in and out of different realms, activism, government, in and out of media. And we've got 2 great podcasters, 2 great broadcasters who have really helped move things forward. So I'm looking forward to hearing what they have to say. We've got some other awardees as well, always very exciting, and we'll get to that right after dinner. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to stop talking. We're going to have some dinner, and then we'll start to recognize and honor some of these folks and have a whole conversation about it. So thank you for being here, and enjoy your dinner.
So I'm Steve Handelman. I'm the director of the Center on Media, Crime, and Justice. Actually, I wear two hats. I'm also the editor of the Crime Report, which logo you can see there. And I have to tell you, I'm always amazed when I see how they transform the student dining hall into this elegant cafe for private, intimate dinner. So I think we should have a round of applause for the folks who organized this to begin with. So I don't want to go into a long promo, but one of the things we do at the Crime Report is promote really good, smart journalism, and that includes journalism of a lot of the people we choose as fellows for our different fellowship programs. We've had over 1,000 journalists who've been gone through our programs since we began over 10, 11 years ago, and this has been one of the most amazing legacies of that Jeremy left us, Jeremy Travis, and it's still continued with great support from President Mason. So I want to thank both of you for your continued support. There's so much to do in criminal justice issues in terms of scholarship and academics, but we also believe, and I know the college believes, that journalism and journalists are critical players. If you're talking about reform, if you're talking about policy change, if the media is not part of the argument, if it's not part of the debate, then the debate really doesn't happen. And we know the consequences of that. So the role that we all play, that you all play as journalists, is so crucial. And I know the fellows who are here this year, they're probably getting tired of standing up every time I mention their name, but I'd like them all to stand up for you to recognize them. This year's John J. Guggenheim Reporting Fellows and Quattrone Reporting Fellows. Please be recognized. So one of the other things we do is we organize the nation's only criminal justice journalism awards. These are the niche awards. Obviously, the Pulitzer is out there. It's a smaller award, but you know, they're still out there. And lots of other awards, the Overseas Press Club Award, but this is the only award, which we started about 14 years ago, that recognizes both the quality of criminal justice journalism and the impact that it has on communities. So when we take submissions from journalists, broadcasters, are not unfortunately yet part of the mix, but we do use some broadcasters and public broadcasters if they have published stuff online. But we ask them and their editors to point out the particular impact they've made on the particular field, whether it's the community, whether it's a national impact, which plays a part in how the jurors decide whether this story or series measures up. And they must have good judgment, these jurors, because some of the stories that we've recognized have then gone on to win the Pulitzers in the same year. So, you know, we're thankful that the Pulitzer watches us and recognizes quality, but we certainly are really proud to recognize the value and the importance of criminal justice journalism alone in all of its many fields. And this goes beyond just sensational reporting or gotcha reporting. This is reporting at the grassroots, looking at local justice systems. We know all the problems of the industry today, but just from judging from the application of the submissions we get, the quality of the fellows who come into us and apply to us through our programs every year, I have to say that justice journalism is still alive and thriving out there, both in the heartland and in mainstream media. I want to have a special shout out to Bill Keller, former executive editor of the New York Times, but who is just leaving as executive editor of the Marshall Project, which is one of the other key outlets that really focuses on criminal justice news. And they are part of the winning array of prospects this year. So we're glad to see Bill here, we're glad to see folks from the Marshall Project as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, oh, good. So before I actually announce the awards, it's no secret, we've put them out in the Crown Report. I also want to recognize the hardworking jurors who have made this possible. They began work back in the fall when they first got the submissions. And I think we got about 75 this year, which is quite a load. We have 6 jurors who are all veteran journalists, experienced journalists, and also quite tired by now, I think. But they worked through Christmas and New Year's to come up in the second round of winners. So I'd like them to stand up and be recognized, because we don't pay them anything. So I'll mention them by name, too. It's Alexa Capilotto of John Jay College, Joe Dominic, Assistant Associate Editor of the Crime Report, Anne Charlotte Givens of the Trace, our own Caddy Gray, contributing editor to the Crime Report, Ted Guest of Criminal Justice Journalists, Mark Obie, another contributing editor and former editor of American Law. Have I missed anything? No. Oh, and of course, last year's winner, we always pick a last year's winner as one of our jurors, and that's Spencer Woodman from Chicago Reader. Spencer, stand up. You get a special applause on your own. Sorry about that. Okay, so what we do every year is we give 2 awards. We give one for the best single story and one for the best series. And these days in journalism, that means that all blurs, because you do a single story, then you have a sidebar, then you have a multimedia piece of it, you have video. It's now very hard to categorize media these days. And that's probably a good thing. As we'll find out in the second part of our program tonight, things have actually morphed in journalism into new areas, and that's what we're going to recognize with our Trailblazers. The media is no longer what it was even 10 years ago in terms of how it tells the story and how it tells the news, and we are trying to keep up with that. The public is certainly more interested in those developments in the media than they might be in reading, as Errol put it, dead tree media, though I have to admit I'm still a fan of dead tree media. But so we looked at candidates for series and for candidates for projects and candidates for single stories. And I want to first bring up the winner of our single story category. And what they're going to do is, last year we had each one come up, they got the award, and they stood around for a photo op, and then everybody clapped, and they went back again, we got the next award. I think we're going to speed it up a little bit and have all of them together, including our runners-up, with a photo op, and then we'll put them together with a photographer there. So I want to have them up first. So our first award winner on the single story is Seth Freed-Wessler. Seth? So Seth has won the 2009, could I get President Mason up? And Errol, do you want to come up as well? So Seth has won the single story award for his story called The Coast Guard's Floating Guantanamo. So you can see it on the Crime Report. It's an amazing piece, an investigation of drug smugglers held by Coast Guard ships outside offshore. The reporting, and just as very typical of the media, is reporting. Seth reports for type investigations. That's what it's called now. It used to be the Investigative Fund. And this reporting was originally published in the New York Times Magazine. It's a year-long investigation. A lot of resources went into it. So, Seth, great job.
Thank you.
Shall I? Yeah. You won't take a picture yet.
Oh, we're doing it later.
We'll do it later.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for this. I'm really honored. I'm really honored to win this along with the other people who've won awards tonight, whose work or are winning. I guess they haven't yet. The only one who has. Their work is extraordinary. I've read it this year and thought it was extraordinary. So I'm really humbled to be here with them. I want to thank some people. First, my editor at Type Investigations, which was until very recently called the Investigative Fund, Esther Kaplan. You know, this is a story about the U.S. Coast Guard, which until recently, or actually until today, if people watch the news, generally only got good news. We sort of think of the Coast Guard as a branch of the military that saves fishermen off of Montauk. And so when I went to pitch a story that I had dug up about abusive detention practices that the Coast Guard was engaging in, Esther listened to me, which I found I really appreciated, and then really stood behind this story and supported it until, as we do at Type Investigations, we brought it to the New York Times Magazine. And I want to thank my editor there, Claire Gutierrez, who's brilliant and who really saw this story through with me until it was published. I also want to thank and mention Kristen Nelson and Joan Weber at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, because after I did an investigation, which I'll talk a little bit about, into the Coast Guard's drug war detention practices, it turned out that the Canadian Navy was part of the sort of human rights abuses that I had uncovered, and so I collaborated with them at the CBC to do a follow-up last year. In late 2016, I was on the phone with a defense attorney, a federal public defender, who I talk to often, who's a source of mine, and I talk to her every few months just as a way of kind of keeping up with what's happening in the federal courts, and she told me that she had a case come in that seemed to her to be rather strange, that flew in the face of things that she thought she understood about the criminal justice system, and involved an Ecuadorian man who was being charged with maritime drug smuggling under a law called the Maritime Drug Law Enforcement Act. And he'd been picked up in the Pacific Ocean, a couple thousand miles away from the nearest US port, and brought to, in that case, San Diego, to be prosecuted for drug smuggling. And what he had told her, his defense attorney, was that he'd been held before he arrived in court for a month on board Coast Guard ships, and he didn't know where he was going to be taken, and nobody knew where he was. And the defense attorney, I think, was kind of like, no, that's not true. It turned out that it was true, and as I began to sort of look into what she told me, I started finding that there were hundreds of cases of people who had been prosecuted under this law, this maritime drug law that makes it a crime in the United States to be found with drugs aboard a boat anywhere in international waters. And I wrote many of these men letters in federal prisons in the US, and they started writing back to me, dozens and dozens of these rather long letters, some of which included, a few of which included drawings, hand drawings of the boats where they had been held. And I began to talk with these men, interviewing them inside of federal prisons and visiting some who'd been deported to Ecuador and to Colombia. And they told a story that later was corroborated by a number of Coast Guard officials of a system of maritime detention where suspected drug smugglers who are picked up thousands of miles from the United States are being held aboard American Coast Guard cutters, often outside, exposed to rain and hot sun, and shackled to the decks of ships. And they're left there, carried around the Pacific or the Caribbean as these boats travel around, picking up more smugglers, finding more people who are suspected of smuggling drugs, until it's time to bring a load of these men back to the United States. And so then they're brought to Panama and flown to the US, or delivered to Guantanamo Bay and flown to the US. And while they're on board, they say that they, and these Coast Guard officials have now confirmed, they're not provided phone calls, their families don't know where they are. In some cases that I reported in the story for the Times, families have held funerals for their loved ones, thinking quite reasonably that these men who went to sea, either their families knew or didn't know that they were smuggling drugs, had died in the ocean. You know, we're in a moment globally right now when in the United States and Europe, there's this sort of really intense effort to push borders outward, to deal with problems that and anxieties about the nation far away from our borders. And when that happens and we exert this sort of might of our legal power, the protections that we expect will accrue inside of the borders don't carry with that exertion, that geographic reach. And so we have a situation right now where every year hundreds and hundreds of people are being detained in this way, and the sort of baseline protections of the criminal justice system don't follow. And so, this story, I hope, has shed some light on that kind of silent part of the American criminal justice system. And unfortunately, it appears that it's ongoing. I got a letter not so long ago from another man who was held like this. So I suppose I should keep reporting on it. But I'm really happy to be here with all of you and excited to hear about the other stories. So thank you.
Our series winner is Hannah Dreyer of ProPublica. Again, it's a hybrid story done with lots of other people. She did 2 stories, actually, both dealing with what is called the flawed federal struggle against the MS-13 gang. The first story was done in New York Magazine. The second one was collaboration with Newsday and This American Life. Her editor-in-chief, Stephen Engelberg, said her articles had extraordinary impact, leading to multiple investigations. So, Hannah, much congratulations as a series winner.
Thank you so much, John Jay College. I was actually a fellow at this conference in 2012, and I was so inspired then by this dinner. And I'm still so inspired tonight by the other honorees. Thank you for fostering this kind of complex, time-consuming reporting about criminal justice issues. The stories in ProPublica's series were about 2 immigrants who were victimized by MS-13 and by law enforcement on Long Island. One was a teenage gang informant who was betrayed by his FBI gang handler, and the other was the mother of a 15-year-old son who was killed by the gang. Her son's body lay in the Long Island woods for 8 months, and local police told her not to worry, that her son had probably just run away. Everyone who worked on this series, even the guy who lawyered the series, had nightmares about the brutality of the subject matter. And I also did, and I wanted desperately to find a way to get these stories to cut through and land with readers. And in the end, we really, I think, made these stories resonate by pulling in partners and pulling in other formats. So for our first story, ProPublica video journalist Nadia Sussman, who's sitting over there, went with me to an ICE detention center to film an MS-13 informant who was named Henry. And she made a video that allowed people to hear Henry tell his own story in his own words and see, we couldn't show his face because of the dangerous situation he was in, but see the outline of his face. This American Life transformed the second story, which was about the mother of an MS-13 victim, into something much more sweeping and emotional than I ever could have done on my own. They really pressed me to ask the questions that I was basically lacked the courage to ask myself about what the mother had been through and how that had felt. And Newsday partnered with us for a print version of that story, and editor Marty Gottlieb really elevated that reporting. So these stories ran, and I was so nervous because the people were taking enormous risks to talk to us. They were threatened by detectives, they were threatened by the gang, and they were just trusting us to get it right and protect them, to the right degree. And the reaction was more than I could have hoped for. ICE and Long Island police changed policies. People donated tens of thousands of dollars to the protagonists of these stories. And somebody wrote to me and said that it was the first time that they had ever felt compassion for an immigrant, which is not totally the target audience, but was very satisfying. So I started these stories just as I was getting back from abroad to the US. And I was so shocked when I started reporting. Things are so polarized right now. When I went out to Long Island, people were calling me fake news. People were dismissing me out of hand. And I think it's so hard, especially now, to break through preconceived ideas about gang members and crime victims and immigrants. And there's so much coverage of undocumented immigrants being targeted by law enforcement and rounded up for detention. But undocumented immigrants also need law enforcement and go to law enforcement and aren't getting helped. And I think that's so important to cover, and I wish there was more coverage of it. So I'm grateful to these people, Henry and Carlota, for trusting us with their stories, and to this team for helping tell those stories in the way they needed to be told. And I hope that there are brighter times ahead for immigrants in this country. Thank you.
We also wanted to recognize our runners-up. And we had so many good quality submissions this year that we actually had ties for runners-up in the single category. And not only were they tied, they both came from the same journalistic organization. And who knew how that happened? So I want to, I think not all of them are here, but some of the representatives are here. So the single runners-up tied are the Marshall Project's Alicia Santo, another former fellow, by the way, for The Victims Who Don't Count, and Joseph Neff, who wrote The Price of Innocence, also for the Marshall Project. So I'd like you guys to stand up first so we can acknowledge you. And I think as Leslie Eaton is representing Alicia, okay, maybe she's not here. And the runner-up for the series article, oh, I know it's not here, is Madeleine Baran of American Public Media, and we call her Madeleine Baran et al. Because there's a cast of thousands that were behind her story, and they didn't come, but Madeleine Baran is working on another story, so she couldn't make it. But let's give her a round of applause anyway.
Okay, folks, you're in for a treat. We now get to the highlight of the evening, the Trailblazer Awards. There's a portion of this evening that goes to recognizing good, solid, innovative, creative, high-impact journalism of a traditional kind. And then the awards go to, the Trailblazer Awards, go to people who are indicating some new directions, people who are sort of lighting the way into some new ways of storytelling and of reporting and of exposing and expounding. These folks are people who, if you're not already fans of them, you soon will be. They are people who Steve in the center here feel are telling the rest of us something that we need to take note of and to acknowledge and to remember and to maybe carry forward in our own work. It's one of the most fun times of the evening, and we're going to do this as follows as you enjoy your dessert. We're going to see a little video of some of the great work that Sarah Koenig has been doing. And those of you who have been enjoying Serial like I have, this is... Everybody loved the first season. Everybody loved the second season. The current season is amazing. I listen to podcasts mostly when I am pretending to work out on one piece of gym equipment or another. And I found myself unable to do my slow cardio because I was getting so damn mad at different things that are going on in Cleveland. And I've never even been to Cleveland. But I felt like I was there. I felt like it mattered. I felt like I needed to do something about it. And that's the whole point, that there's a lot going on that we need to know more about and be able to convey to people thousands of miles away in a sweaty gym on an elliptical machine that, you know what, this matters. This matters to you, and there's something you need to know, and there's a way to absorb it in a way that you might want to get off that machine and do something about it. So let's watch a little bit. What's that? Oh, we're going to listen, right. You know, there I go again, TV guy, right? Doesn't get it. We're gonna listen a little bit, then we'll have an introduction, and then we'll hear from Sarah.
From This American Life and WBEZ Chicago, it's Serial. One courthouse told week by week. I'm Sarah Koenig.
Hi, thanks very much. I'd like to know the record 611-707-8.
We're trying to get rid of cases. If somebody is offered to plead to a misdemeanor, you take it.
You graduated from high school. Do you have any common sense at all, dude?
Yeah, where is he?
I don't know. I can't answer
Not
that.
guilty. Not guilty.
That's
of
fine.
it.
But you still have to go through this.
I shouldn't have went through with the situation. I shouldn't have went to court.
Wait, you regretting it?
There was a lot of talk that they would check in on him and hope that that means protecting him.
It's tomorrow.
Tomorrow?
Yeah.
Why would you have any court dates? Why would you have a court date coming up?
In your experience as a police officer, can you smell raw marijuana in a bag inside someone's pocket?
Yes.
He's this walking perpetuation of don't trust the police.
I'll tell you how we fix that. We don't go. When somebody calls us and tells us that somebody's at a rec center with a gun, we don't go.
How can you help us do that?
What's the solution?
How can I help y'all do that?
Listen, I went through the things that I was going through when I was younger because I was young and dumb.
Again. Oh my God.
I know. I kept trying to tell him, like, there's more to this story. And I don't know what you want me to tell you, but that's the honest to God truth.
Please join me in welcoming to the podium Julie Snyder, the co-creator of Serial.
Thanks, you guys. It's such a pleasure to be here, and it's truly my honor to introduce Sarah Koenig as a 2019 Media Justice Trailblazer. 5 years ago, Sarah and I started making Serial from the basement of Sarah's house, which meant like blankets and pillows thrown all around to try and muffle the noise, and pausing recording when her kids would flush the toilet upstairs. And for us, like, that was kind of the beauty of doing a podcast, because we sort of figured, who listens to podcasts, you know? Nobody was listening to podcasts. We felt like it was absolutely no pressure at all. When we first started, we were gonna release the first season of Serial. Our plan was that we thought if we could get 300,000 downloads for an episode, we would be really happy with that. 300,000 would be a totally respectable number. And what ended up happening is that we did reach 300,000 downloads 5 days after we launched the show. And within about 6 weeks, we had more than 5 million downloads on iTunes, which was the fastest that had ever happened. And then after that, we just kind of started breaking records all over the place. As of now, it's been 3 seasons later. We've had more than 420 million downloads of the 3 seasons of Serial. I know. We've been told that Serial was downloaded in every country in the world except for North Korea and Eritrea, which leads us to be like, I don't know what Eritrea's problem is, but. Anyway, I'm gonna tell you guys all of this because I wanna give you the sense of scale, basically. I want you to, and I wanna brag, but other than that, I wanna give you a sense of scale of why Sarah is being honored here tonight, for the enormous impact that she has had on the general public's understanding of the criminal justice system. Its successes and strengths, but also more importantly and more potently, its weaknesses, its failures, and its need for reform. Sarah began her career as a newspaper reporter, kind of a just the facts kind of endeavor. She covered local news and politics and the courts, beginning at her home newspaper on Long Island, and then she at the Concord Monitor and the Baltimore Sun. She started freelance stories for the public radio show This American Life, and then came on full-time as a producer and reporter, and that was how she and I met, and we started working together. The nature of our relationship is basically like I'm the editor to Sarah's reporter, and it's been probably one of the most fulfilling relationships I've had in my entire life. Sarah is exceptionally thorough. She's heroically dogged. She's a model for careful, responsible reporting. And also, and I feel totally confident saying this, she's one of the finest, most gifted writers working in broadcast media today. She's actually probably one of the best that's ever done it. I think sometimes it gets overlooked when people try and assess, like, why Serial? Why did Serial become such a success? Like, why is it connected with such a large audience? And there are factors that go into it, like the subject matter and the storytelling and the production and, surprising and thoughtful interviews. All of those things are true, and we work hard at them. But really, if you really pay attention to Serial, you'll see what sets Serial apart is really Sarah's writing. She's an amazing writer, and it's what makes the series better than anybody else's. Serial's first season was about a murder case in Baltimore, and as soon as it aired, listeners began to ask Sarah and the rest of the Serial team, what does that case, the murder conviction of Adnan Syed, what does that case tell us about the criminal justice system? Which was a totally fair question. But it was also one we'd sometimes stumble over because we knew the answer was that case was not like the ones that were filling America's courthouses. They weren't in America's courtrooms every day. Nothing about the Syed case was typical. A defendant with no criminal record, a private defense attorney, a 6-week trial. The fact that there was a trial at all, non-Syed cases are not what's filling America's courtrooms. And Sarah knew that in order to truly understand the American criminal justice system and to understand why so many people working in it and living in it say that it's broken, she'd need to look not at one extraordinary case, but instead at its opposite, which was ordinary cases. For the most recent season of Serial, Sarah and our colleague Emmanuel Jochi spent more than a year in Cleveland's criminal courthouse, watching the unflashy cases that reporters don't usually pause over, like marijuana possession, assault, disorderly conduct. The series didn't include any trials. There was no surprise testimony. There were no smoking guns, no rousing closing statements. Instead, through gripping, emotional, and often like rage-inducing interconnected stories, Sarah and Emmanuel exposed the racially inflected machinery of a system that was built for plea bargains. More than 8 million people have listened so far to each episode of this past season of Serial. 8 million. With her extraordinary talent, Sarah brought awareness for needed reforms to one of our most important democratic institutions. And she documented something that's difficult for reporters to capture engagingly, what justice means for people in the criminal justice system. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce you to the 2019 Justice Media Trailblazer, Sarah Koenig.
Before I say anything else, I want to make it super clear, I do nothing by myself. Every single thing I make that you've ever heard is a total collaboration and principally is shaped by Julie Snyder. I make nothing by myself. I am a figurehead up here. That said, I am very happy to be here, and I feel lucky to be here and really very humbled to be here with Brittany Packnett and with everybody here. A Trailblazer, I suppose, should also feel powerful, like a Chevy SUV. I looked up the word Trailblazer the other day to make double sure I knew what it meant. I already knew what the word Trailblazer meant. But looking it up was a procrastination from writing these remarks, and writing these remarks, in fact, was also a procrastination from doing some research on a case that I'm looking into. The case is from here in New York. It happened in Harlem. A young man shot and killed 2 police officers as he was being led into the police station at West 135th Street for questioning. And not insignificant to the case, the defendant was black, the officers white. The guy's defense at trial was essentially a PTSD defense, that he'd been traumatized by cops for years, and he went into a panic at the thought of being hurt by them again. And he said he actually couldn't remember exactly even what he'd done or how many shots he'd fired. All he knew was that he was scared. He said for years, any time a crime went down in his neighborhood, he'd be accosted by detectives, and they'd beaten him a handful of times to the point where he'd had to take to his bed. As I said, the case went to trial, and during closing arguments, the defense attorney recounted all the times his client had been roughed up by the cops in an effort to get the guy to confess to crimes he'd committed or had not committed, or to get him to inform on other people. They did not succeed in either, his lawyer told the jury. But they did create in his mind a horror and fear of the police, which meant physical agonies and torture of the human soul. I do not desire to indulge in an attack on the police department, the lawyer said. In its rank and file, the police force has men who are willing to give the best that is in them to the service of the people of the city. But I cannot understand why some men, immediately on donning a police uniform, become instruments of horror and cruel methods. I challenge the district attorney to deny that there have come to him reports that policemen have beaten persons in order to obtain information. If the police cannot detect crime except by unlawful methods, then woe to the city of New York, for the people's rights are being crushed to the ground, unquote. The lawyer who made that speech is my grandfather, actually. That's how I came upon this case. I know, he was good. I've been looking into his old trials, and I came upon this one. And the year that this one happened was 1922. Almost 100 years ago. And I gotta say, I was struck reading about this case, how familiar it sounded. Apart from the use of the word persons, someone could be giving this speech to a jury or a judge in a courtroom right now, today, in Manhattan or Cleveland or Baltimore. To borrow a sentence from my grandfather, I do not desire to indulge in an attack on the police department. That is not my point. My point is that very little of what we see in the news is new. Just check out the rest of the front page of the New York Times from that day in 1922 when my grandfather made his closing argument to that jury. In Albany, a report documenting waste, mismanagement, favoritism, and profiteering in a government agency. Here in New York City, an affordable housing crisis because, quote, builders generally are turning to the construction of expensive dwellings as affording a better return on their money. In Washington, D.C., House members met with lobbyists to talk about a bill regulating immigration. In Poughkeepsie, attempted sexual assaults on women at Vassar College. I swear on my Chevy Trailblazer, I am not trying to depress you. I know our society is better and fairer in 1,000 ways than it was in 1922 for all kinds of people. It's just that when it comes to criminal justice, I get confused sometimes about what progress looks like. Consider 1922, New York City was safer than it is today. In 1922, relatively fewer people were locked up, and the people who were locked up spent less time in prison than they would today. Also, more trials happened in 1922 than they do today, and more people were acquitted at those trials. And believe it or not, in a bunch of ways, the criminal justice system was less discriminatory in 1922 than it is today. So, New York City, 1922, less crime and less punishment. I'm not standing here today to say it was better in the olden times. All sorts of outrages were at play in New York a century ago. I could list them, but you already know what they are. Because, and here's what I am going to stand here and say to you today, because for 100 years, we reporters have reported the same stories of injustice, the same stories of crime and punishment. We've all held up the same beautiful concept of fairness, and we've all demonstrated the same inability to agree on what it means or who it's for. I more or less understand how we got here. I understand how certain pernicious situations persist. What I don't understand, and what I've spent a lot of my career excavating my way through criminal cases to try to understand, is how situations change. What constellation of empirical and emotional factors can unglue the status quo? What mix of ingredients can wash away a hardened rut? I was listening to the radio the other day about how Colin Kaepernick settled with the NFL, and they had this sociologist on from UC Berkeley to talk about it, Professor Harry Edwards, and he was saying, yeah, now was a good time for Kaepernick to settle because the movement was in decline. He said these types of movements, they last about 6 years. He was so definite about it, 6 years. Black Power movement, he said, 1966 to 72. This one, 2012, Miami Heat and LeBron put on hoodies. About 6 years later, right on time, Kaepernick settles with the NFL. Professor Edwards said that if you go much longer than that, without policies, without programs, without progress, then you just are getting in a cycle of protesting. Then you're just drama. And it made me wonder, am I in the drama business? Do I broadcast drama so that someone else might use it to make progress? And if so, when is my 6 years up? I say to people all the time, I am not an advocate. I am not on anyone's side. It's the journalist's cliche. I'm just after the truth. I'm just trying to inform the public. But in our heart of hearts, in my heart of hearts, I know that that is not the whole story and that I am not alone. I think all serious-minded criminal justice reporters are stealth reformers trying to change their own beat. Because what is the point of the truth? What is the point of information if it's not feeding progress? New Yorkers knew back in 1922 that cops were beating the daylights out of suspects, especially black suspects, in the back rooms of their station houses. New Yorkers know today that black people and other people of color are disproportionately abused by the criminal justice system at every turn. We know this. Knowledge is not our problem. Fixing it is our problem. I sometimes flirt with despair over the fixing, but that's where Brittany Packnett comes in. She is trailblazing the bejesus out of all kinds of messes, ancient and modern. She is figuring out how we gather in our arms centuries of blood-soaked past and make them matter to an information-soaked present. In that regard, at least our work overlaps. We are both trying to claw our way into people's consciousness, to make them care without unduly bumming them out. The thing that I fear most in our country is the death of certain principles. Ordinary principles, honesty, freedom, tolerance, equality. When I was young, I thought that they were solids, like columns of stone at the Lincoln Memorial, a site that, as it happens, opened for business in 1922. Now I know how ephemeral these principles are. They're more like holograms that exist only insofar as we're able to imagine them and remember them and protect them. John Jay's mission is to educate fierce advocates for justice. And I especially love that the word fierce is in there because that's what it's going to take, ferocity. Maybe some of you students here are going to try those other professions, attorney, politician, academic, police officer. I personally would like every single one of you to become a reporter. But regardless, lasting progress in the realm of criminal justice will require ferocious accuracy, ferocious persistence, ferocious kindness. If you haven't already gathered, I'm not hugely optimistic when it comes to this stuff. But right now I have to say, standing in a room with Ms. Packnett and with all of you fierce advocates for justice, I do feel hopeful. And my hope is that 100 years from now, in the year 2119, when my granddaughter listens to one of my criminal justice stories, she won't think, huh, sounds familiar. She'll think, what the hell is she talking about? Thank you very, very much.
I'm Brittany Packnett. I'm an activist, an educator, and a writer, and somebody who very fervently believes in freedom and justice. I'm obsessed with the combination of love and power. There's a quote from Dr. King that I discovered after I had already started using this phrase, but he essentially says that power without love is reckless and love without power is anemic, right? It's not useful. But the two of them together are really the force that can change the world. And so I'm really obsessed with this idea of being as powerful as I can and having that power be informed by love, being informed by love for myself, for my people, for my community, for this country, for this world. If people who have power decide to use it in loving ways instead of some of the ways that we're seeing right now, we'd have vastly different outcomes. So being an unapologetic educator, leader, speaker means telling the truth out loud and in public, not backing off from it, not letting anyone convince you that it's wrong simply because it makes people uncomfortable. I am a believer in purpose, I'm a believer in calling, and I feel like the calling on my life is to speak and teach truth to move people to action. and really helping people understand that we are legitimately stronger together. Whether the way that they take it on is through women's rights and reproductive health, or LGBTQ issues, or immigration issues, all of those things are knit together in a fabric of freedom. And none of us are free until all of us are free. And so as a cisgender woman, I am not free until trans women are free, right? As a person who was born in America, I am not free until immigrants are free. And I try to do more to help people connect the dots between our struggles, to help people recognize that people of color are the global majority. So freedom can actually be ours if, for example, we stop using the word minority, because we're not one. If we actually work together in solidarity instead of in competition. I'm grateful that there have been a lot of successes as we built Campaign Zero. We wanted to create a platform that was usable by literally anyone. We wanted to give people access to information and to a new way of doing things. So if you go on to joincampaignzero.org, what you see is the data that tells you how it is and the policy that tells you how it can be. And so we literally wanted to make something that people could print out and take directly to their mayor, to their police chief, to their city councilor, and say, this is what I want to see happen in my community. And here's 60, 100, 3,000 other people who want to see that happen with me. You are meant to fill the gaps that you see. If you see a gap in society, in justice, in the way in which the world works, it is because you were uniquely positioned to help fill it. But you have to actually get there and be conscious enough about what that gap is and what talents and treasure and time you have to offer to filling that gap. Teach for America has evolved over many, many years. We are nearly 30 years old, and one of the primary and I think most important ways in which we've evolved is our orientation to culturally responsive teaching, diversity, equity, and inclusion. We know good teachers come from everywhere, but we also know that there can be an additional profound impact if the role model that you're seeing in front of your classroom looks like you, or came from where you came from, or grew up in similar socioeconomic circumstances. Matters of identity matter in the classroom, and how you think through yours, and how you approach your students, and how they approach you. Those are all things you have to be thinking of alongside the rigor and the academics in your classroom. A lot of times people will look at folks like me or DeRay or Netta or whomever and see us operating on a national level. This all started with local work. And yes, we have national influence now, but this is still local work. All politics are local. And so if the difference that you want to see made is in how children experience their education, then go to a school board meeting and find out how those funds are actually being allocated. If you want to see a difference in how veterans are cared for because you yourself or someone that you love or care about is a veteran, you need to actually go visit the VA in your area. See how the care is. Ask them what they need, because chances are you have a way to actually help and support that. I think it's important to ask yourself that question about what you want to see be true in the world because you are here. And then to start with your neighborhood, with your region, with your community, and figure out how you can make a change on that thing right where you are.
Okay, I was asked to give an introduction to Brittany, and I want to do it more or less as a fan, and as somebody who has been admiring the work that she does. And I would like to think that I understand some of it, and I want to enjoy all of it, and I want to follow it and see where it goes. And I think that's the whole point. I want to point to, she's got an extensive biography. She said I don't have to read the whole long one, but I kind of want to. But look, as a professor of journalism, I teach part-time at the Koenig Graduate School of Journalism. And every year I hear from students who say, if I care about something and I show that I care about something, won't that discredit me? Won't that make it seem like I'm not neutral? Won't that make it seem like I'm not fair? I said, well, you can make that mistake, and that is a challenge that you have to be aware of. But the much greater challenge is doing mediocre work because you're writing and reporting and doing stuff that you don't care about, right? That's the real problem. You should worry more about being a boring journalist than about being a passionate, committed journalist. You'll never get in trouble for caring too much about your subject matter. It will take you into places. It will show you different avenues of reporting, different angles. It will actually enable you to be a better, in my opinion, fairer reporter of what you see, because you really want to get all of the nuances down, and you're going to pay more attention than the people who don't care. And I think of Brittany in that way, because she leads with her heart. From the protests in Ferguson that we all saw, to Teach for America, to the Ferguson Commission and President Obama's task force on 21st century policing, she's there. She's in it. She's talking in a way that you just saw. She's bringing insight. She's bringing herself and her heart and her hopes and just laying it out there and letting people know what she cares about. And that's kind of where I think the trail that she is blazing is leading all of us. Care a little bit more, be a little bit more passionate. Don't get so hung up on which institution or institutional role you might be playing. Because as you've seen, she might serve on a federal commission. She might work with something like Teach for America. She might be doing something that I still can't even believe she's doing. In addition to all this other stuff, she's doing Pod Save the People, and they're on the road doing stuff live. So they're going to be in New Orleans, and they were just in Brooklyn, and they're going from city to city to city, talking to crowds, doing great work. A very listenable podcast. You should check it out. She's doing TED Talks. She's showing up in London. She's showing up everywhere that she's needed, and she's making a life and a career out of it in a way that many of us, I think, should just both admire, try and learn from, try and support to the extent that she's raising issues. That website they created with all of the policy issues, the Vision Zero, was Vision Zeros now. It was extraordinary, and it went from the website to national discussion. I will tell you, I'm on CNN 4 or 5 times a week. I would check that if we were going to talk about criminal justice. I would check that before we go on the air. Why not? What are the issues that people are talking about? What should Hillary Clinton be thinking about? What should Bernie Sanders be thinking about? Where are the Republicans going to go on criminal justice reform? Well, there are a number of sources that you would normally check. You're going to check the Vera Institute. You're going to check a number of the usual sources. But after you're done checking with what they've got at Brookings or whatever they've got going on, whatever discussion's happening at the Marshall Project, you would look at everything. And you want to see where the communities are coming from. The movement for Black Lives was absolutely setting the agenda in New York City for any number of weeks. And it was something that if you didn't understand it, you were kind of on the outside looking in. So I want to invite to the podium a trailblazer whose journey is going to take her and us to places that we can't quite anticipate. I think it's a fascinating kind of question mark out there. Where are we going? Where is this going to end up? Which of the many reform items and possibilities are going to actually become policy? Which of the many young people who are being inspired by the work that was done ever since Ferguson are going to rise to leadership, get themselves elected? She's working on those kind of projects as well. I think it's a fascinating story, and we're going to hear, I hope, about whatever the next chapter might be. Please join me in welcoming to the podium Brittany Packnett. Brittany Packnett.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I think the second most embarrassing part about that video, besides just having to sit there and watch myself, is how many hairstyles I've been through in the last few years. You got to keep it fresh and interesting. I want to thank John Jay College not only for this honor, but for the work that you do every day to change the future of criminal justice in America. I met Carol Mason when I was but a young buck on the President's 21st Century Policing Task Force, and you took a lot of pity on me and great care of me. And it is deeply inspiring to see a Black woman doing what you do every single day and facing down systems that were never built for us in the first place. So I'm deeply grateful for your leadership, for your friendship, and for your kindness. Yes, absolutely. I want to shout out some fellow St. Louisans in the crowd because I saw my friend Rachel Lippman when I walked in. Listen, there were not a lot of people who reported accurately on Ferguson, but I can tell you that Rachel was one of the folks who did, along with many of her colleagues at NPR and in St. Louis. And so I want to thank you. I want to congratulate the other honorees. When I first saw the poster, and they were like, the other honoree is Sarah Koenig from Serial, I was like, I must not be the person you're talking about because there's no possible way I could be next to her. The stories that you all tell cut straight to the core of who we are in our darkest times and in all of the places we want to ignore. And when I listen to Serial, especially this last season, I hear my cousin, I hear my uncles, I hear folks who I am able to hear from every day, but I know the rest of the country doesn't. And so I am grateful for you all being brave enough to tell the stories that nobody else will tell. And I'm deeply, deeply honored to be sharing this honor with you. A couple of other shout outs, the Marshall Project, ProPublica, Vera Institute, you all provide a lot of the research and the reporting that we share on Pod Save the People, and we are really there to act as amplifiers and help people make sense of the knowledge that you bring us, and so I'm grateful for your work. I'm deeply grateful to all of the journalists in this room, especially knowing what you are going through right now, knowing that there was someone just apprehended who wanted to take out some of your colleagues. I thank you for waking up and doing what you do every single day because it informs us to be able to do what we do every single day. In their absence, I thank DeRay and Sam and Clint, my co-hosts on Pod Save the People, and my brothers in arms and my fiance, Reggie, for your patience and your support and for being really quiet when I record the podcast. So it was early one August morning in 2014. And by early, I really do mean early. It had to be about 3 or 4 a.m. because that's when we were up to edit the newsletter. It didn't actually matter if we had slept the night before. We usually hadn't. We still had to compile, fact check, edit, and share the news. Ultimately, over 12,000 people worldwide subscribed to our very first venture, the Ferguson Protester newsletter. Before there was a podcast or Campaign Zero or a sea of policy change, before there were grand speeches or TV interviews, before people wanted us for documentaries, and back when people were calling us low-life, classless black thugs, all we had were our tweets, our vines, our periscopes, and our words. We collected every one of those we could from one another and from our burgeoning protest community and created a newsletter to do what we were slowly discovering was the essence of protest, telling the truth out loud and in public. First, we told that truth with our bodies, next with our platforms, then with this newsletter. And many people don't know that this was our first very accidental foray into telling stories on the importance of what we now refer to as police and criminal justice reform. We were just tired, physically, sure, because 2 a.m. tear gas night after night tends to do that to you. But we were tired of living the truth while the news reported lies. We were tired of having our lungs worn from shouting the facts while mainstream outlets were silencing our voices. Our spirits were certainly exhausted from having to scream just to have our humanity acknowledged and still so often be unsuccessful. And in those early days, DeRay and Netta were the public faces of the newsletter, and my dear friend and law professor Justin Hansford and I, we were the shadow editors. Because both of us had professional positions, ones that were more important to our communities than they were to our pockets, that had already come under threat because we were audacious enough to be black and have an opinion on our dignity and the killing of Michael Brown Jr., who, as far as I'm concerned, is the real founder of the Ferguson Uprising and what you may now know as the Movement for Black Lives. The 4 of us were up early that morning discussing what was next. By now, we had been producing the newsletter for a week or 2, and we were quickly becoming a digital and grassroots organizing collective of 4 folks who were just tired of being tired. We had to decide who we were going to be. So yes, at 3 or 4 in the morning, somewhere between a protest and a job, between a nap and a shower, we were determined to define our driving principles. And we arrived at 3. 1, low ego. 2, high impact. 3, truth, always. And these have been the marching orders my entire life, but certainly in these past nearly 5 years of what I consider to be the next chapter in the civil rights struggle in this country. See, I do not come to this work of storytelling as a journalist or as a political editor or as an operative. I come to this as an activist. I come to this as a person always concerned with telling stories to achieve freedom and not ratings, to pursue justice and not sensationalism. We have always fought not because we want to, but because we have to. We come to this with as low an ego as humans can muster, as deep a desire for high, real, felt, demonstrable impact as humans can achieve, and as committed to the awesome responsibility of inconvenient truths as humans can be. I come to this work of telling the story of people and data and fact with the hope that the truth will actually once and for all set us free. At first, the decision to be radically candid in every form of media was to simply survive. In the spirit of Zora Neale Hurston, when we stood in the streets of Ferguson, we knew that if we were silent about our pain, the police could have killed us and told the world that we enjoyed it, that we asked for it, that we had it coming. Cell phone cameras stood between us and a lie. Tweets stood between us and arrests. Live streams stood between us and death. Now, we use every platform at our disposal because cell phone cameras and tweets and live streams still stand between us and lies and arrests and death. Sometimes they protect us. Other times, they do not. Black and brown and poor people are still losing the battle for the dignity of ourselves every single day at the hands of a system that was never built to serve and protect or rehabilitate us. Women and LGBTQ and disabled folks of color walk daily in bodies still policed simply for daring to exist and not cower in shame. Immigrants can't afford to dream American dreams anymore because it's the dreaming that gets you caught. And because those inconvenient truths still exist, we have to keep coming back and telling that truth until there is no more story to tell, until the truth is something else entirely, until the only thing left to report is that love is alive in public and justice rolls down from those hills that Martin talked about, but we can't even see. Tonight, I charge us with listening to all of those stories that don't make it to Apple or to Spotify, that can't be downloaded with one click, and you can't purchase a ticket to hear them live. Those stories live with the man standing outside the bodega you frequent. They live with the neighbors who can only afford to move out as your block changes. The stories you most need to hear are the stories of the lynched voices whose names hang in memoriam in Alabama and the silenced voices that once roamed Rikers. The stories you most need to hear are from the freedom fighters whose names you'll never know and whose pictures will never grace our flyers. The stories you most need to know are right next to you in classrooms and on playgrounds and cabs and Ubers and Lyfts and buses and subways and sidewalks. Chances are you have not heard these stories, but that is by design. We're socialized to conceptualize injustice like it's an episode of a critically acclaimed drama, sensational, gritty, but episodic. It's not. Injustice, especially in this world at this time and in this political age, is not an anomaly, it is a constant, and surviving it, a lifestyle. We are trained to believe that the stories we haven't heard are unheard because they either don't exist or because the victims cannot tell it. The stories exist, we just haven't been listening. And everyone can tell their story. We just have to have a low enough ego, desire high enough impact, and love the truth enough to stop trying to be a voice for the voiceless and instead pass the mic. We continued the newsletter to be sure that the words of people were being heard alongside the voices determined to speak for us. More people subscribed, and the more that happened, the more we realized that we needed to give people as many ways to access the truth as possible. So we launched We the Protesters, a database and community for activists across the country. We started the Ferguson Fireside conference calls with America, allowing anyone from around the world who wanted to hear our voices from the ground call in. And I was nominated to write the Ferguson Protester Open Letters. still ghostwriting, now less for positional security and more for the sake of community, I consult with members of our growing protest family and do my level best to carry our collective voices through to America without interruption or shame. I had written a few letters by the time we began to get word that the grand jury would be returning any day with the word on whether or not Darren Wilson would be indicted for killing Michael Brown. In anticipation, I wrote 2 letters, ready to be sent to the thousands of people who had signed up for our text and action alerts the moment we heard the verdict. You already know what happened that night. Here's the letter I wrote, the one that we ended up sending. In Ferguson, I said, a wound bleeds. For 108 days, we have been in a state of prolonged and protracted grief. In that time, we have found community with one another, bonding together as family around the simple notion that our love for our community compels us to fight for that community. We have had no choice but to cling together in hope, faith, love, and indomitable determination to capture that ever-escaping reality of justice. After 108 days, that bleeding wound has been reopened, salt poured in, insult added to the deepest of injury. On August 9th, we found ourselves pushed into unknown territory, learning day by day, minute by minute, to lead and support a movement bigger than ourselves, the most important of our lifetime. We were indeed unprepared to begin with, and even in our maturation through these 108 days, we find ourselves re-injured, continually heartbroken, and robbed of even the remote possibility of a judicial resolution. A life has been violently taken before it could hardly begin, and in this moment, we know beyond any doubt that no one will be held accountable within the confines of a system to which we were taught to pledge allegiance. The very hands which we pledged that allegiance were not enough to save Mike in surrender. Once again, in our community and our country, that pledge has returned to us void. For 108 days, we have continuously been admonished that we should let the system work and wait to see what the results are. Well, the results are in, and we still don't have justice. This fight for the dignity of our people, for the importance of our lives, for the protection of our children is one that did not begin with Michael's murder, and it will not end with this announcement. The system you have told us to rely on has kept us on the margins of society. This system has housed us in her worst homes, educated our children in her worst schools, locked up our men and women at disproportionate rates, and shamed our women for receiving the support they need to be our mothers. This system you have admonished us to believe in has constantly, unfailingly, and unabashedly let us down, kicked us out time and time again. This same system in which you have told us to trust, the same system meant to serve and to protect its citizens, has once again killed 2 more of our unarmed brothers. Walking up a staircase and shot down in cold blood, we fight for Akai Gurley. Playing with the toy after police had been warned that he held a BB gun and not a real gun at only 12 years old, we fight for Tamir Rice. So you will likely ask yourself, now that the announcement has been made, why do we still take to the streets? Why do we still raise our voices to protect our community? Why will we still cry tears of heartbreak and sing songs of determination? We will continue to struggle because without struggle, there is no progress. We will continue to disrupt life because without disruption, we fear for our own lives. We will continue because Assata reminds us daily that it is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love and support one another. We have nothing to lose but our chains. Those chains have bound us, all of us, up for far too long. And do not be mistaken, if one of us is bound, we all are. We are all together bound up in a system that continues to treat some folks better than others, a system that preserves some and disregards others, a system that protects the rights of some and does not guard the rights of all. And until this system is handled, until the status quo that deems us less valuable than others is no longer acceptable or profitable, we will struggle. We will fight, we will protest. Grief, even in its most righteous state, cannot last forever. No community can sustain itself this way. So we will continue to stand for progress and stand alongside anyone willing to make a personal investment in ending our grief and taking a personal stance in achieving justice together. We march on with purpose. The work continues. This is not a moment, but a movement. The movement lives. So I tell you tonight that the movement lives. I'm grateful for this immense honor, and I accept it on behalf of each and every brave storyteller who lives difficult truths every single day because they choose to fight. I treat it not as an accolade, but as an indication of the work ahead and a symbol of my ongoing responsibility to amplify, always question, always tell the truth, and pass the mic. Thank you, and God bless you.
So while we wish Brittany farewell, you got to come back soon. I don't know if they both didn't tell you, but they met today with 12 students at John Jay, including some student podcasters. If we had had time, we'd talk about them, but I understand it was a fantastic, inspiring session. So before I close and wish you all a good evening, I can't close without thanking some of the people who made this evening possible. We thanked our funders and donors and contributors at the beginning of the meeting, and I want to thank the folks who actually made the machines go. Folks at our center, I'd like them to stand up. Nancy Bilio, Ricardo Martinez. I want to thank my colleagues at Center on Media, Crime, and Justice, Ted Guest and Joe Dominic. Some of our interns were here, Julia Pagnamenta, Lauren Sonnenberg. They're still here, if they could stand up. And I also want to thank, a lot of you may have noticed, we've got we call them student ambassadors. They're the ones who brought you to the seat. They took your coats, they took your tickets. Without their help, some of them work for the Prisoner Reentry Institute here, or they're undergrads or grads at John Jay. Without them, we couldn't have made this conference go. So if they could all stand up, everyone else who I haven't mentioned who worked, let's thank them. Don't be shy. Okay, so that does it for the evening. And all I can say is I'll see you next year. I have no idea what direction we're going to go in our Trailblazer direction, but I can't, of course, end without saying a special thank you to Errol for his superb emceeing. And we'll see the rest of you, our fellows, first thing tomorrow morning. Thank you all. Go in peace.